Hello, everyone. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Forever Forward podcast. And today we have a very special guest, Robert Philbrook, popularly known as Bob. And we are together going to talk about the future of asset performance management, but particularly from the healthcare sort of sector space and zeroing down on UK as a market. But before we get started, hey, Bob, thank you so much for making time to join us for the podcast. Would you like to say hello to our listeners?
Yes, I would. Hello. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be able to give you perhaps my view of how the hard FM industry's progressed in the time that I've worked in the sector. So I'm sure it won't please everybody, but it'll please some people. You know, the things that I might have to say purely as observations as well.
But again, Bob, I mean, the entire idea of this podcast and the Forever Forward community as well is not to say things or discuss things that pleases everyone, but things that is good for the community, something. And so I hope, as you rightly said, some of it eventually gets picked up and obviously open to feedback as well.
Absolutely. I'd welcome any feedback, and you're absolutely right. It is for the good of the industry, for good of the for the client, for the people that are carrying out the maintenance, and particularly in hospital environments for the patients. So I think that's very important to remember. Yeah.
Absolutely. And very interestingly, I heard a podcast a couple of weeks back, which I posted about as well. It was probably a TED talk where one of the, nurses was making a very passionate plea on why nursing staff needs to be at the center of the digital transformation that's happening across healthcare from the perspective of patient care. I'm sure there are some inspiration that we can draw from healthcare in that sense.
That's very interesting. You should say that, because I think that there's quite a disjoint between what an FM company think they need to deliver to what perception the end user, the nurses, the nursing staff have as a perception of what they should. I mean, I could give you a clear example of that. One day I asked a nurse, when they draw 15 milliliters of a drug into a syringe, what's their tolerance on that? She said, what do you mean? I said, well, do you allow +1 mil, -2? And they said, no, it's 15. That's what you draw. So typically you get a very good understanding of what they're all about and the way that they carry out their tasks. Where typically if you ask an engineer that very same question, he would say, well, +1 mil, -2, something like that. So I think that the outlook is totally different, and the perceptions of what we do as an industry to what they do as a nursing, because bearing in mind we're doing the same job. We're doing a mechanical maintenance, they're doing a physical maintenance.
Absolutely. Their patients are humans, our patients are assets.
Absolutely right. And I think that really does need to be better understood, because how many FM companies actually ask the nursing staff, how well are we doing and what could we do better? Very, very few, because they're frightened to ask, because they know perhaps what the circumstances are around what that decision might be given from.
That's brilliant. But I think I held you by making this point. I held you from passing on your introduction. So Bob, I had the pleasure of interacting with you 2 to 3 weeks back. That is where we decided that we must talk again. But I'm sure why don't you give a brief introduction of your phenomenal career that continues, as you yourself say that you don't want to rest. So tell everyone about your work in the healthcare space.
I work for a major construction company, and my role at that time in the early 2000s was mainly around quality, safety, and environmental management systems. But because I had this aptitude for getting things done, I was given pretty well all of the business critical projects to manage and deliver. And one of the very last projects that I undertook for them was, I was asked if I was interested in managing the mobilization from an existing 100-year-old estate into a brand new PFI hospital. Well, I didn't know anything about FM and the FM industry, so it was a challenge, but something that I was really keen to get involved in. And because I think that I didn't have a history of FM, I took everything back to first principles. And the first principles were, what do we have in the building? How long does it take to maintain? What do we need to maintain it? Who do we need to maintain it? So working on those principles, I put together with a very, very a good team, competent team, to put together the asset information for the brand new PFI, which meant that we started from scratch. Now, in saying that, the PFI was built by the same company that we're going to carry out the maintenance. So that made it a little easier, I guess, for the introduction. But as a first, we were there 8 months before the handover of the PFI. So that meant that I had a lot longer to prepare for the handover than most FM companies or organizations would generally. So I think that that brings me to something to say, that I think that for brand new PFIs, I think that the maintenance contracts have got to be let at least 9 months before handover, because how else do you understand what you're going to be maintaining? And another example of that is that the builders didn't understand why we needed so much information about the assets. Because they totally misunderstood the concept of maintenance. So we built up then a very good understanding as to what we wanted to do and why we wanted to go into the estate early, so that we could understand the critical systems. One of the things that we did was buddied up our leads, critical system leads, with their build construction team, so that there was very, very good passing of knowledge. But one of the things, Ramesh, that we did, I was walking around the building one day and I saw one of the builders using a tablet, and I asked him what he was doing, and it was the fact that he had a BIM model of the estate, and that was something totally new to us as a maintenance organization. So again, from that we understood then the benefits of BIM, and the fact that we could line trace, we could do all of those things in the new build that wasn't possible before, because everything was on a BIM model, on a model. And I think that that sort of revolutionized the way that we started to look at things and look at the way that the hospital was built. And it certainly helped us with finding everything that's in the building. Because one of the other things that we learned is that from the existing estate, which was over 100 years old, the asset density in the new build was probably as a factor of 5. So that's where you start to get problems around when you win tenders. They normally base their tender on a pound per meter rule, which is a very, very old rule. So it doesn't take into account the asset density for these new buildings. So straight away, when contracts are won, they struggle with budget because it's under budgeted, underfunded. And the expectation is that this brand new hospital will be kept pristine, in very good condition. But because of the asset density and the considerably more number of assets that are in the new builds, it's totally underfunded. It makes it very, very difficult for FM organisations to carry out maintenance in accordance with budgets, because you know what commercial people are like. They're quite difficult to communicate with sometimes. But in saying that, some of the initiatives then that we had to look at to try and reduce the cost of maintenance, multi-skilling the technicians, we changed the CAFAM system so that it was mobile technology enabled. We even did some assessments of critical breakdowns so that we knew hotspots, so that we could then put stores and equipment in areas that we knew were typically going to be more vulnerable to breakdown.
Now, that's a host of stuff you did, and maybe the reason why I wanted to take a pause, and probably we would love to delve deeper into each one of them or some of them from that perspective, and just maybe this was how long back was it in time was this?
2010 to 2000. It was actually 2010 to 2016. The entire mobilization of the existing estate into the new estate. So
not that old and not that recent. So that's not then back in time, but not that recent as well.
Absolutely right. But bearing in mind that was my introduction. I've done a lot of work since in the FM industry, which from the lessons I've learned, it seems that we still make the same mistakes, unfortunately. And so that's where I'm really pleased to be able to have an opportunity to, talk about what those things might well be and how you can best learn from them. Yeah.
So, I think a couple of things. I think one, when you mentioned about first principles and you not being from the FM background, I've honestly, number of people I've come across who've not been from FM background, but have been able to make maximum impact is phenomenal. Probably just explains that maybe people who are not from that background don't come with that baggage. So, like you mentioned, you're able to look at first principles. So, maybe Bob, that will bring me to the first question to you. Over the years, what do you think has remained constant? And what do you think has changed when you look at hard services in healthcare? What's remained constant and what's changed?
I think that let's get on to the good bit. What's changed is there's far more technology available now to help you manage your CAFAM regime. And that is, we talked about BIM modeling. We've talked about the CAFAM systems themselves are much more user-friendly. They're much more comprehensive.
Right.
In that, there's a lot more modules now that interact. You can go from the CAFAM system to a commercial model to a stores model, which then makes the CAFAM system the central hub for containing all of the information that you might need and all of that intelligence that you might need at a later date to give you a better understanding of how those assets are performing. So
correct.
I think that the BIM model, the CAFAM system, the other is the fact that you've got these systems now that the BMSs. I was trying to come to. So the BMS, I think that's one of the most underutilized utilized pieces of equipment that you'll find in facilities, and that is that I found that at the estate that I was at, it was probably the most advanced BMS that was available at that time. But we knew so little about it. The builders knew so little about it, and we, as the maintenance organisation, knew very little about it. So, one of the things that I did very quickly, it was a Schneider system. I very quickly made contact with Schneider about how we could better improve the system, what training was available for us, because it seems that on more than one occasion, I've seen these BMSs in cloakrooms with a jacket put over the top of them, and I'll say, well, what's that under there? Oh, that's the BMS head. Oh, what does that do? Oh, I'm not quite sure about that, but it's there, and that's what we've got. So I think there's a general naivety about how much that BMS could improve performance of our assets. And I don't understand why FM organisations are so reluctant to put somebody on the BMS head 24/7, because for me, one very good BMS technician might well be worth 10 technicians, with the amount of information that's available and the things that they can do remotely might well mean that you don't have to send somebody out to look at things. But the other thing, Umesh, is about a lot of the estates that I go on that are PFIs. They'll have more than one BSM. They'll have more than one head, and they'll be all over the place. And it'll be that they're different systems, but there's no appetite to make them more compatible and to bring them to a central system. So I don't know why that is. I don't know why.
But the point you mentioned that they are underutilized, right? But I think and again, probably today there are softwares available which probably would not even need for you to put someone right in front of the BMS screen 24/7. But I think it brings, according to me, what my experience has been is that very few FM companies until recently, things have changed in the last 12 to 18 months. But until recently, when you go back in time in 24 months, there was hardly any motivation for them to use better data. And if you don't need data, it doesn't matter whether it's there with you or not. And that was precise the reason why BMS continues to underutilized. In fact, even CMMS continues to be underutilized in that manner. That's my take. I mean, it's like if I don't need it, so I won't look for it. But once I need it and I look for it, that's when I really want to figure out that, hey, how conveniently could that be available? And that's where, in my view, things are changing. But interesting that you make a point on PFI and non-PFI. So what I wanted to lead on to the second question maybe is, how are things different to PFI as compared to a non-PFI when you look at healthcare sector? Like what changes?
Normally the PFIs are new estates, the new hospitals, it's new intelligence, it's a new brush, if you like. Okay. Whereas the non-PFIs are always generally existing estates.
Got it.
They have what they have in terms of asset intelligence,
right?
Which normally, for different reasons, isn't very good. When I first went to the estate that I referred to, I asked the general manager, "How are you getting on, Mike?" He said, "Well, we were getting on all right until the trust asked us to keep maintenance records." So I knew then at that point where I was in terms of what my expectations should be, and how I needed to change a culture of, this is how we've always done it, to how we need to start doing it in the future. So that took some doing. But you take them on a journey. Everybody comes on the same journey. Yeah.
Right. Now, one of the things obviously is I like with little work that we've done in the UK. I mean, and I'm assuming it's going to be the same with probably all the countries. There's a lot of stress that happened on the healthcare facilities as a result of COVID and everything that happened, which probably made the assets operate in a manner that they were not designed to operate. Right. And I think that's where one of the use cases has been that if you can use data, you are able to drive better decisions purely from asset performance, asset life cycle, so on and so forth perspective. Have you seen that evolve? I mean,
yeah, very much so. You only have to walk into any hospital these days to see it's absolutely full. For day visits, or the wards are full, the hospitals are full to capacity. So that does put a tremendous strain on not just the nursing staff but also the facilities. And so it's best then, how do you best maintain them to keep pace with the nursing activities? How do you keep pace? So, and the other thing that does, it makes it very difficult under life cycle to be able to change anything, because how do you shut? There's no resilience now in the NHS in terms of you can't move people from one ward to the other while you're, doing what you need to do.
The life cycle and stuff,
yeah. So that means that everything's under so much pressure. But the only thing I think that there is around that is more of a responsibility to keep the maintenance regimes running much more stringently to how they are, and that might mean more maintenance.
So you probably intervene more than designed. So you don't do, if you were doing once every 3 months, you probably intervene early, or you are suggesting that you deploy technology and you do condition based and all the stuff we talk about.
I think they're both hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. I think one of the things that you just said there actually is quite interesting. I think I still find a lot of problems with when you start to look at maintenance regimes for critical systems, for instance, which is what I generally focus on when I go into a PFI or an estate, because they're the things that are the most important. I find that some have come up with their own maintenance regimes. So they're not looking at HTMs, they're not looking at O&Ms, they're not looking at best practice. But for instance, they might say that they'll do a reoccurring 3-monthly on critical plant, whereas then they're not looking at the 3-monthly, 6-monthly, 9-monthly annual maintenance regimes that these things need. So in effect, they're changing a filter, changing a belt, wiping some oil off something, and so it's not getting perhaps the maintenance that it needs. And I think that's a generalization of what I've actually seen. I see. So it's about, other than the fact there's still a lot of debate about what needs to go into the CAFAM system anyway in terms of critical plant. Because you get commercial intervention that will say, well, we didn't tender for that. But as a one-liner, it always says at the beginning of these contracts that our equipment will be maintained in accordance with statutory, legal, HTMs, O&Ms, best practice, manufacturers. So for me, when I looked at what I was looking at, and that is again at first principle, for me, there was no debate. That all had to go in. And what I do recommend now to estates when I go, particularly to the operational leads, is that you can't leave things out unless you mitigate it. So I always stress the fact about trying to keep a risk register to say that, we know what we should be doing, but the commercial decision is that we don't. But then who has made that decision? Because Murphy's law is that what can go wrong will go wrong,
right?
And so if there's no record of what your ethos was around the maintenance of that piece of plant and equipment, then how do you justify your action? It's normally then going straight back to the operational team, and it will be that, why didn't you maintain it? And then so up till that point there'd be no record as to why they didn't do something. So I think it's very important that if they do decide that they're not going to do something in accordance with, that there's a risk register retained, and it just it explains as to why they've mitigated that and decided not to do it.
That brings me, that's an interesting point. So that brings me to the point, I mean, if you look at the connective team, you said, if there are, I mean, and by the way, there are very clear guidelines as far as the health technical memorandum is concerned, and the various provisions of how critical systems should be maintained.
That's right.
And stuff like that. You have the annual verification, all of that going in and stuff. So it's just coming to the question, given that so much is changing in healthcare, stressed assets, everything, what's the role of a modern day FM company as in what the modern day healthcare facilities need? Clearly it's changed.
I think it's changed because there's so much pressure on the assets and the way that the hospitals are run these days. But I think it still goes back to the basic principles of general maintenance and the maintenance regimes. Because I know that when you've mentioned condition-based monitoring, from my view on that, I think it's a very good move. But in the estate that I worked at, I did express my preference for condition-based monitoring, and they said to me, the trust, when you can provide me records of maintenance for all of that equipment that you want to move into condition-based monitoring, we might consider it. Until then, go away. So I think that I don't want condition-based monitoring being used to replace or to disguise the fact that there's a lack of maintenance on something. I think that they go hand in glove.
No,
You've
obviously.
got to do the maintenance, but you've got to do the critical, the remote monitoring as well. I think that's it rather reminds me of when I was sat on the runway coming back from my holiday, and I thought to myself, if you asked the maintenance team, if you adopted for this airline the same maintenance regime as where you work, would you get on this plane? And I can honestly say I have asked that question lots of times when I go into estates, and there's a lot of them that will laugh, and you know that
You've got your answer. You've got your answer there. Yeah.
But from that, it's that when you look at these critical systems that they have in an aircraft, and they're telling you that this equipment is running correctly, whereas we tend to use it in FM to say that it's running badly, and that's because of our maintenance regimes. I think that's because you need to run this remote monitoring on equipment that isn't maintained to get that intelligence to say, this is why it's not running properly. This is what's going to happen if you leave it. But then once you've got that level of intelligence, I think that it then has to be adopted onto plant and equipment that's regularly maintained. And then it's used as a proactive tool rather than a reactive tool, if that makes sense.
That absolutely makes sense. I love the fact, the airplane analogy. I'll probably ask some of the guys when I go next. Coming back,
I'm not a good flyer, you see, so I always wonder those things.
There's a lot of talk, obviously, on technology, data-driven maintenance, and I think you've answered some of the context already, where you say that any movement to a new way of doing things should only come once you have done in the past things correctly in the way it's expected to be done, right? I mean, and it should not be like a what should I say, a replacement or an either or. The basics still remain the same. But what, according to you, does the pathway to transform state look like? Because let's say, I mean, honestly, not everyone would have done things the way they expected and stuff like that. But what does the pathway to transform state look like? Because
I think that there's a disjoint. I think you get some evangelists within a hard FM organization that will say technology is the way forward, but it's very, very rarely done in partnership with the operational teams. I think that there needs to be much more dialogue between the two and with the trust, so that everybody gets a better understanding of what you're trying to achieve, rather than, you want to try and introduce condition-based monitoring, but you've not told the operational teams and you've not told the technicians that that's what you wanted to do. Because the other really good thing about doing that is they can tell you an awful lot about what's going on to help you then implement condition-based monitoring, because they know a lot of this plant and equipment quite intimately. I think that that's
because
undervalued,
they are the ones who interact
most that they know. So I think that they're a bit of a lost cause sometimes, in that they're the very last in the food chain of communication. But really, anybody that wants to change anything, they should be the first to be consulted, so that you can get a better understanding of the plant and equipment that they've been maintaining for years. How does it function? What goes wrong with it? And then that can help you build this picture of preventative maintenance.
Absolutely, because I think, as you rightly said, and again, the analogy that I was trying to draw right early when I spoke about the podcast of the nursing staff. I mean, I think if you look at the triangle in healthcare, the healthcare has patients, nurses, nursing staff, and doctors. And, asset management of hard FM has assets, junior engineers or technicians, and senior engineers, right? So I think, they interact more often than not with the assets. They look at things more often than not. They listen to things more often than not. And if there is a way for all of that to go through, but that obviously represents a bigger challenge, and I think that's where the opportunity also exists. Do you also see there's been a broadly in hard FM, not just in healthcare, there has been this talk of knowledge issue, where you're saying that the most senior engineers are going to retire soon. There's a retention issue. Is that
absolutely
how critical does that become for a critical operation like in healthcare facility?
I think that's it's a critical situation now in that you've got a lot of people that worked within the industry that are ready for retirement. And I'm not surprised, you know, with the way things have been for anybody that works in healthcare over the pandemic. They're ready to retire, but it's all of that knowledge
And
that
that
they
goes
take
away with
with
them.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and I know that you see a lot around apprenticeships, modern apprenticeships, but I think we might be leaving all of that a little bit too late. Because the other thing to bear in mind is when you're bringing in technicians from other industries, baked bean, tin factories, you know, all of those, and you bring them into healthcare, it's a different environment entirely. You know, and you can't have them standing on the bed to change a light bulb, which, you know, I'm not sure that they would do that, but it is a different environment where patient care is paramount. And I think that there's quite a transition for anybody that comes into healthcare to understand that you're not there to maintain things, but it's got to be maintained in such a way that you don't disrupt patients, nursing staff, all of those sorts of things, where normally they would have been doing that in a totally different environment. Yeah.
And do you think there's a role of technology to play there to bridge the gap? I mean, tools that can be provided better, because there's tons of information. There have been some PFIs which have been in operation for 10 years, 12 years. CAFM systems having tons of data but hardly accessible. Do you see a point of revolution happening there?
Yes, I do. I think that that's got to be, when you get issues like this, I think you've got to use more than one solution. So you've got to use technology, you've got to use the resources, you've got to use perhaps changes in design. There's all sorts of things that you've got to use now, because I don't think that we'll ever return to a less frantic environment than we are now. I think it's always going to be the same. So rather than deal with that day in, day out, and everybody gets burnt out, let's collectively look at ways that we can find solutions. You know,
Makes
the
sense.
trust,
Makes sense.
everybody look at ways to find solutions for it. Yeah.
Now,
Because ultimately, it's the patients that suffer ultimately. Yeah. Otherwise.
absolutely, absolutely. So that kind of brings us to the close of the podcast. It was really interesting talking to you, listening to first principles. The fact that you mentioned first principle, elements of change management, and all of that. But maybe as a summary, what are your top one or two recommendations for modern day FM companies to really get their act together? And say,
I actually, your question 5, I really found quite interesting, really, because we all talk about net zero.
Right.
My experience of that is that when I work with organisations, they talk about net zero, but fundamentally they don't know what their carbon footprint is anyway. So one of the things that I do with organisations is let's work out what your carbon footprint is as an organisation. You know, what's your reliance on fossil fuels, so that then they can start to put in some clear measures, and then they've got something to measure themselves against. So every time I ask this question when I go into organisations and into healthcare, I rarely get that they understand that they really should have been working out their baseline first before they start to look at initiatives. Otherwise, you've got nothing to measure yourself against.
And I think, and that's again goes back to the first principles, right? Like, I mean, one of the things I've observed in healthcare facilities across where we are operating, your FD has said something else, and you assumed it's operating at that level. It's never operating at that level anymore. Add 25, 10%, 20%, and your baseline's change. So, but again, that's first principle. I think that's a role which FM companies can clearly play, and say that, hey, you know, PFI, if you want to go net zero, we are your best partners, because we know the baseline, we know the assets, and stuff like that. But again, I've hardly seen any FM company put a foot right in this direction. By the way, they're still struggling.
Yeah, and there's so much available. You know, you can go onto the Carbon Trust and you can get the models.
Right.
You know, I do that with companies, and we come up with a carbon footprint. But so everybody talks about carbon reduction and net zero, but then they've not really established what their carbon footprint is anyway to be able to set some realistic goals. So I don't quite know that they understand that that's what you've got to do to go back to that first principle. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bob. I mean, as a recap, I think if I could just sum up this in one line where Bob says that we're never going to go back to a previous times. Things are going to be stressed. I mean, as far as healthcare facilities are concerned, and which in turn means that the FM teams and the assets that they maintain are going to be in equal or more stress. And the only way forward is to be able to make the best use of technology, go back
Yeah.
to the first principles, which are engineering,
Yeah.
and make the most of the resources that's available, with a very special focus on how do you retain the knowledge as an institutional knowledge and not just as an individual's knowledge. Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate you taking time out. This was really
Pleasure.
interesting talking to
Oh,
you,
thank
and
you.
I'm hoping that the listeners can pick up a insight or two to act on.
I hope they feel the energy, because I've got plenty of energy and plenty of understanding. So yeah,
Absolutely certain.
I've really enjoyed it, and thanks for the opportunity. Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you.